consequences.
Okay, welcome to Spirited Conversations. I'm your host, Mike Wilson, and each session we invite some very interesting people and have conversations. I've been privileged in life, I think, to have a front row seat to some of the most interesting people and have these intimate conversations. There have been many times when I've wished that I could invite some of my best friends in on these conversations. And so I devised this little talk show, and I'm inviting some of my best friends to be a fly on the wall or a spy behind the wall and to secretly listen in to some of these fascinating conversations. I'm not sure those are the best metaphors to use for my some of my best friends, but to have some interesting conversations and to focus on the things of God. And I've got my good friend Sebastian Stroughter, who is with us today, and featured guest David Posey, who's been a really good friend of mine, one of my very best friends in this life for many years. We started Focus Magazine together. We go way back, don't we, David?
Yeah, you're
I hate to admit how many years, but we've done a lot of things together, gone on vacations together, gone to Europe together, Christy and David with Andrea and myself. And so had a lot of really good conversations about spiritual things. And I'm excited about today's topic. David and I, along with Sebastian, are going to be kicking around the whole idea of what it means to try to imitate Jesus and to become more like Jesus. In 1 John chapter 2, verse 6, for example, the Bible tells us that whoever says he abides in him ought to walk in the same way in which he walked. That's a tall order and good fodder for diving into the conversation today. And so in terms of becoming more like Jesus, first question is unbelievers might wonder what the big deal is. You know, why can't we just be ourselves? There are all these different personality types. Why be a replica or a clone of anybody else, let alone someone like Jesus? Does that mean that you lose your personal identity? That what's involved in becoming more like Jesus?
Well, let me start off by saying that, when I was growing up, and I'm one of those who grew up on the pew, like you did, right? Born and bred on the pew. And, it seems like that for many years we heard that a definition of a Christian was that he was someone who was like Christ. And always became the pat answer, right? It would be like Christ. It seems like we got sophisticated and got away from that. Now we started talking about other things. It must be deeper than that. And there were some deeper aspects to that term Christian, but I think we missed something along the way. And I think, as people said, be like Christ, I think it came back to the question you're asking, not so much from unbelievers, but everybody. And that is, how can we do that? I mean, there's that, and then why would we want to? Obviously, we can all do what we want to do. We can all act like we want to act, be ourselves. But I think that's a little naive, because I think most everyone has been influenced by someone else. And probably if we could have if there's some data on this or some science on this, we'd see people who are a part of their parents. They're a part of other people who influence them. When I was a kid, I've always been a big baseball fan. When I was a kid, I'd always try to imitate somebody. I played baseball quite a bit, and I'd be imitating somebody's batting stance, Murray Wells or somebody's wind up. And I still catch myself, so once in a while, Christy catches me in the kitchen doing that, imitating.
Sandy Koufax, no doubt, right?
Koufax, my favorite. And I've got all this stuff in this room here, Dodger stuff and all, and football. So I really think it's a little naive to say for an unbeliever to say, well, yes, I'm just going to be myself. Well, okay, good luck. I mean, I think that's a tall order itself, and you don't even know who yourself is. You know, you have to do some deep dive there. Um, so I do think though this is really key. I've been reading several books lately that brought this up. I wasn't reading them for this purpose, but it came up. I think you've read The Divine Conspiracy. Dallas Willard wrote, and of course he has a lot to say about that. There's a book called The Impossible Mentor by Ray Hollenbach, where he actually addresses this question in terms of believers. But yeah, I just think that it's the whole point is to be, the whole point of our life is to be like Christ. We accept that. Unbeliever may not, obviously, but so I don't know what to say to an unbeliever if it's beneficial if you find Christ beneficial. That's the starting place, right? If Jesus is beneficial, then trying to be like him is beneficial.
It's certainly true that people have told me that they see my dad in me, and other people that I admire. Imitation is the highest form of flattery. So we all do that. I mean, from the time that we're kids, we have heroes, we have role models, and all that. But I think that you get to a point, though, as a human being, as an adult, in carving out your own identity, and we all have different personality types. And Paul, the apostle, says in Galatians 2:20 that I have been crucified with Christ, and it is no longer I who live, but Christ lives in me. And so one of the practical nuts and bolts questions would be, in terms of identifying with Christ, we're all different, and Jesus seems to be somewhat unique. So how could imitating him be beneficial if there are areas where I sense that I'm so different than maybe he was? I mean, are you understanding what I'm trying to communicate there?
Yeah, I mean that's like the $1 million question, right? I mean that's what Hollenbach. When I picked up Hollenbach, just kind of just found it interesting. His book was the Impossible Mentor, and he had asked some college students. He was teaching at a seminary, and he asked these students, "How many believe here that we're supposed to be like Christ?" Everybody raised their hand, And he said, "How many are doing it?" And of course, it was crickets. So there's this huge gap between what we recognize as the goal and what we're actually trying to do. And I think that's the problem. We see Jesus as so special. I remember talking to a young lady once, and I was talking about this, even about temptation and the fact that Jesus was tempted. And they said, we're supposed to follow, this. I was going through the whole, imitate Jesus routine. And she said, yeah, but he had a boost. He had a boost.
Well, I've heard people say, well, yeah, well, he was the Son of God, and I'm not,
Right. And I don't know how far we want to get into this right now, but I think there's a key there. I think our exalting of Jesus's deity, which we of course want to do, but we've diminished his humanity in our minds. We forget that he was in all respects like we are. I mean, Hebrews 2:17. He was. It was your grandfather. I was thinking of this illustration as I was thinking about this, and this. I was thinking somebody used to run around. He was acting all excited about the fact that Jesus is our elder brother. He kept saying that Jesus is our elder brother. And this is like 50 years ago, or 40 years ago. And I'm thinking that was Mike's grandfather. He was like, I don't know if this is something he just heard, that kind of just clicked with him at that time or whatever it was. But I'm saying, what's the big deal here? I'm not catching this.
Yeah.
And but he is, we're his brother, and I think that's hard to swallow because of his. So I think we have to distinguish, to be practical. I think we have to distinguish his role in the world from his character, and what we're being asked to imitate is the character of Jesus and his, his words, actions, thoughts, even whether they're revealed, attitudes, and wherever we can along that line. That's what we're asking. We're not, we're not gonna die on a cross, that's for sure. But we are to be like him.
Sebastian, did you have something there?
No, I was going to actually extend the sports analogy a little bit because um, we've all heard that, be like Mike. And I'm not talking about Mike Wilson. I'm talking about Michael Jordan. A lot of basketball players want to be like him because he's this symbol. But the interesting thing about it is over time, and it almost doesn't matter what stats the person has, how many championships or whatever. In a lot of people's minds, they'll never be anyone as important to basketball as Michael Jordan. Although you've got lots of folks who emulated him, who learn from him, who watch his game and take on aspects of him, but then they're their own person. You might have a LeBron James or a Kobe Bryant, whoever, Steph Curry, all of them pick things from Michael Jordan, but most people will say they'll never be as great as Michael Jordan. And when I think about Jesus, I think about that. I think that none of us are ever gonna add up to what he is and what he was, but we'll pick up aspects of him and include our own personality and become the best us who we can be.
Well, I mean that does, and you've partially answered the questions as it relates to this, but you have people that are saying that's a daunting proposition. How could I ever measure up? How could I ever even attain a minuscule part of my Lord's perfect character? I can relate to Peter warming his hands in the fire. I could relate to, some of David's mistakes, but with all my imperfections. But Jesus, I mean, you've got a sterling character, and so what do we say to that, or to that person, to give that person confidence in even making the attempt? Why not just throw our hands up in despair and say, this is impossible, why try?
I would just say, using Sebastian's analogy, is that I think a young person who thinks that way is defeated already. I think we see that in sports. Nobody's in the major leagues because they decided they couldn't do it. I mean, everybody wants to be like, name your star, right? Everybody wants to be like that person. And I think it's in the effort. It's in something that D.A. Carson calls grace-driven effort. That we make this effort to be like Christ. What other standard are we going to use? Michael Jordan's a basketball standard, but in life, who are we going to settle for? Who else is a worthy person to emulate? Only Jesus is, and that is where we have to start. So I think to those people, I say, well, if you're going to think that way, then you're defeated already. There's no why even talk about this. And clearly, there's plenty of scripture that tells us that if we're serious about following Christ, that we have no choice. We're predestined to be conformed to his image. Romans 8:29 says that's what we're supposed to be doing. That's what we're supposed to be aiming for. So,
very good. And I think you've partially already answered this next question, but one of the difficult aspects of this in following in Jesus' footsteps is separating the parts that can be replicated from the portions that no one has any business reproducing. None of us can be the unique Son of God, King, Messiah, miracle worker. And so where do you draw the line in being a legitimate copycat versus, borderline sacrilegious or even crossing that line?
Well, I think that it's that's kind of, well, I don't want to sound, this sounds condescending. I don't mean it that way, but it sounds a little bit obvious when you look at some of the things. I mean, somebody who thinks that they're King Jesus, or somebody who thinks that they're
Right.
they've got a messianic complex or something. I mean, we've seen plenty of people like that come down through time, and we kind of identify them right away as being a little off the rails. But I do think it's a valid question as we kind of go through the details. What we're doing, we have two classes in which we're dealing with this right now, talking about this topic, and one of them are mainly teenagers, and the other are adults, and it actually takes a different path. Interestingly enough, both of those, and we're just going through the scriptures and saying, okay, here's what Jesus did. What do we illustrate? What can we take from that? What can we emulate? And obviously, there's a lot of things we can't. When he heals the paralytic, we can't do anything with that, right? As far as doing it, we can show compassion. We can. There's principles there that we can draw from that. So I think you take the Jesus's teaching, his words, his actions, his demeanor, his relationships, the way he dealt with relationships, and then we make that effort, and that's how we separate. Not things that we identify as his unique things that go to his unique ability.
This is a line that is often blurred, it seems to me, particularly in the religious world, where you have cult leaders, for example, taking on a messianic complex. You have some evangelicals even that have tried to play master to their own disciples. And so I think the distinction you're making is extremely apropos to what needs to be said. Any other comments along those lines? We don't want to cross the line in trying to play Jesus in areas that are unique to him, but we also want to emulate his character in all these other areas.
I would say the key. Is humility, and I think the thing you look for or you watch for, even in yourself, when if you're seeking to control people, because what we're talking about in these examples you give are people who that's exactly what they're doing, whether they intend to do that or not. I think in most cases they probably are. They're intending to control people. I can't think of anything more oxymoronic than a Christ-like control freak, right? That's not. That wasn't Jesus's control. He wanted to influence people and wanted to bring them to God. Eventually he said it's the cross, of course, that would draw all people to himself, right? In John 12. So he wasn't just out to control people. He could have done that if he wanted to, but he didn't. And so I think when we see that or identify that in ourselves, and we know we're on the wrong track. I don't think we're.
Well, maybe the key is I never cross that line from disciple to master, because there's only one master.
Yeah.
And as long as I remain a disciple, I'm imitating character, but I'm not imitating the precise role.
Yeah, this, Mike, that in the New Testament times, a master had disciples, meaning somebody had, just in the typical scheme of things, the master-disciple relationship. And the disciples were able to exceed the master. In fact, that was kind of the goal. You bring somebody along. If you're training a young preacher, you want him, you really do want him to exceed you. You want him to be better than you. That's part of being a coach or a mentor or whatever. But Jesus says, you know what he says? It's enough in Matthew 10, 24, 25. He says, it's enough if the disciple is like the master. He turns that idea, that master relationship thing on its head. And in his case, it was enough if you can be like the master, not exceed the master, because that's not going to happen. And I think that's what he's getting to there. And that was different than what the typical person in those days heard. So yeah, kind of just makes your point. I think Jesus made that point. You don't get to the master. If you can be like him as much as possible, that's good.
Yeah. I was going to say too, I think that is the key in the be like him, not be him, because he's an authority figure. Like if you go to a job You might go to a job where they're teaching certain things or doing certain things, and you have a boss who shows you how to do something. You want to be like that boss. You want to learn those things from him, but you don't want to take over his position. You'll get in trouble. So I think that's what we're looking at here. Jesus is the high authority. We want to be like him, but we don't want to step into his shoes because we can't.
Right. I like the fact that Dallas Willard uses the term apprentice in a couple of his books. It talks about the apprentice, and if we kind of get away from the disciple idea a little bit, just to kind of look at it a little differently, we're interns, or the intern to a doctor wants to be like the doctor, right? I mean, he wants to be like the teacher, and so I think a disciple means to be an adherent to the master, and join yourself to him, and to try to emulate his ways. And so everything we're talking about this morning is built from that word. That's, if we're truly disciples, that's what we're trying to be. That's in the definition. So yeah, it's learning a skill, and what have you.
I think it is kind of dovetails with Matthew 23:8, but you are not to be called rabbi, for you have one teacher,
Right.
and you are all brothers.
Exactly.
And so we never get to be the rabbi. We never get to be the one who does who gathers the disciples around himself, and they're disciples of me. No, we replicate people who are going to be disciples of Christ, not ourselves. And so again, humility is a huge factor in that. Proper understanding of who Jesus is in comparison with who we are.
Yep.
I've seen a lot of materials playing on the theme, what would Jesus do? One writer with an alternative medical bent asks, what would Jesus eat? And I suppose in an election season, we could ask, how would Jesus vote? So are those fair questions to ask, or are they too hot button?
I'm sure Jesus ate a lot of fish. Right.
Okay.
I'm pretty sure he killed so many fishermen, but I think that what would Jesus do thing, I think has gotten a bad rap over the years, and because just on its face, it looks pretty good. I mean, I know that what would Jesus do movement kind of turned into bracelets and little things you wear around your neck and all that kind of stuff. So it wasn't maybe taken as seriously, but it seemed like it's a pretty good starting place. And yeah, there's nothing wrong with those questions, is there? I mean, how would Jesus vote? Shouldn't I kind of at least think about that? I don't have the answer exactly. I have a feeling he wouldn't vote at all, maybe, but I don't know. But no, I those are good things, because I think asking those kinds of questions, we might think of them as trivial, but they kind of get you into the habit of thinking about this, and looking at this from every angle. What would Jesus do? What would he say in this circumstance? Before I speak up, I should think, what would Jesus say in this? That's what we should do. We know how rarely we do that. I like the saying that don't speak if it doesn't improve on silence, right? So
yeah,
if you think about that before you say something, then you say, okay, how would Jesus handle this, right? That's what we're doing, and we have enough information, I think, to make pretty good decisions on all those, even those things that sound trivial.
Right. I saw a placard outside someone's yard on Facebook, and it had 2020, and above the 2020 was Jesus.
Yeah.
I thought that's pretty good.
That's good. We can all agree with that. And no matter who wins, that's going to still be true, right?
True.
He wins
That's
every
exactly
election.
right. Yeah. Well, it's also Halloween season. We're recording this 2 days before, and you see people wearing costumes. What's different about what you're proposing versus dressing up and playing Jesus?
Oh, well, almost that sounds like a silly question, right? As it come, it sounds like a silly question, but I think it's actually a pretty profound one.
Yeah,
Because
do I need to change my hair and put a Donna robe and put some sandals on and walk around like, I live in the first century? Uh, people might be tempted to do something like that.
if you're around in the, what was it, the 80s, 70s or 80s, 60s, maybe, I don't know. But you had those, they called the Jesus people that walked around in togas, and you find them in airports, and you had that Hare Krishna, crowd and all that. I mean, they really were kind of taking on that kind of persona, even in the physical sense. I get a kick. I don't know if this relates. I think it does. I like to think of Jesus in modern situations, or when you look at some of the events. For example, the rich young ruler. I have a picture of Jesus talking to a young man um, under that heading, the rich young ruler, and he's leaning up against his Corvette. And the only problem with the picture to me is that Jesus is still in a robe. You know, the young man's in modern garb, and Jesus is still in this toga, talking
Yeah.
to him. It was the long hair, the whole thing. And so I'm thinking it'd be better if he put him in a polo shirt, right? Jesus, because that's what if he was here. So I think this is what we separate the first century Jesus from everything else and every life. And he's still here. There's still a presence, and that presence, of course, is in his word. And so uh, I don't think, it's not about, look, I think the more profound nature of that question is there are a lot of people who, without dressing up, are kind of just using or looking at Jesus as a figure without actually putting him on. We're supposed to put Jesus on. It's not a costume. And if we put on the costume of Jesus, that's bad news. I mean, that tells us that we're faking it, right? We're trying to fake it through life, and so that's no better than the Pharisees were in their day. So we put on Christ, and that's all over the New Testament.
Yeah, if it's only costume deep, it's external rather than internal.
Exactly,
And this is an internal transformation.
exactly.
Yeah,
So that's
Mike.
actually a really good question.
Yeah, go ahead, Sebastian.
You know, I think you actually raised a good point here because some people do just, in essence, put on sort of the costume of Christianity where they just want to look like they're holy and, at least appear to other people to be like Jesus. But, the idea of, for us, as David was saying there, to put on Christ. And in that sense, sometimes what we, it's back to what you were just saying about us doing things. Whether we're doing them um, based on what we would do, or whether we're examining what Jesus would do. What would Jesus do in those situations? Um, and part of the importance, I think, of examining what Jesus would do is that we should choose move forward based on what Jesus would do rather than what we feel, what our emotions lead us, or that type of thing. Um, and in doing so, in doing those actions, it'll teach us to be more like him. And we may feel uncomfortable with it at first, but ultimately we will feel comfortable with it. Take for instance, and I've told this before. I'm sure you've heard this, Mike, where I missed the World Series. I was a brand new Christian, and I missed the World Series for a Sunday night worship. And I was sitting in the pews. I was mad, but I knew that's what Jesus would have me to do. But now, like, because I chose to do what Jesus would do. Now, if somebody offered me tickets for the World Series for a Sunday night or Wednesday night or whatever, I would tell them to keep them. I'd rather now do what Jesus would do, but not back then. But it takes the practice, and it takes wanting to be like him and examining the choices that we have before us. What would Jesus do? And choosing to do that, no matter how we might feel inside.
Yeah.
I think that this is such a lofty undertaking. It may seem to some people too pie in the sky or too utopian. Do you have, David, any practical guidelines for implementation? How do you translate the ideal into a practical everyday strategy?
It is a lofty undertaking, and Jesus didn't say to get in your raft and it's going to be smooth sailing, right? He said, he said, take up your cross, deny yourself, and follow me. So that following him, that's what really we're talking about. He gave the invitation early on, come follow me, right? And so we're supposed to be following him, and that was not easy for those disciples, and they got more difficult even as time went on. So I think that's kind of the baseline. That's where we're starting, is we're supposed to be following Jesus in order to be like him and take him on. From a practical standpoint, I think Sebastian just mentioned some things, and that is practicing it, doing what you know to be right, even when it's hard. I related to what he said. I wasn't a new Christian in the sense I was, as I said, born. My dad was a preacher, and sitting there, I was mad a lot of times because I was missing. my parents were my parents were immovable when it came to going to services, and so I spent a lot of times when I was not happy. And even last night, we have a class on Wednesday night. The elders are having a class in Nehemiah, elders and elders' wives, and I have to say I was glad the Dodgers wrapped it up on Tuesday. So, I would not have missed the class, but I might have had my mind in some other place. I think practical application guideline. I think we have to be really honest with ourselves, because I think it comes down to how we use our time. I recently had cataract surgery, and they put a needle in my hand, and fortunately, the nurse said, this is going to be the worst part of the whole thing. I'm thinking, okay, they're going to cut into my eye, and this is going to be the worst part of the whole thing, but it says they're going to put the needle in my thing, and the needle had a tube attached, and it went to a plastic bag that had stuff in it, liquid in it of some kind, presumably to do something for me, to help me. So I was connected to that, and that was running through my veins, it was running through my body. And I got to thinking about that in terms of what we're connected to on a daily basis. And I say this because I'm trying to get around saying what we all know, and that is we have to be connected to the Word. We have to be listening constantly to the Word. We have to be immersed in it. And people hear that so much, it just goes right over their head. Read your Bible. Okay, yeah, got it. But how else do you get there? How else do we know anything about Jesus, what he did in every circumstance, except that we read it? So the connection we have, if I'm connected, let's just take that analogy and say I'm connected to Facebook for 4 hours a day, or I'm connected to Twitter for 4 hours a day, or I'm reading novels for 3 or 4 hours a day, or I'm watching movies. You can't watch a movie for less than 2.5 hours, right? And that's just what I'm connected to, and I'm making sure I see well, didn't that there are things influencing you other than Jesus when that's happening. And so I'm not saying, they have none of those, don't do any of those things. I'm saying that we've got to spend enough time in God's word so that we know how Jesus would respond to these things that we're talking about.
Don't you think, though, that one of the problems with our current society is we get into a rush and we want everything instant, instant processing. And in order to really make application of the word, you have to not only spend time in it until you get into it and it gets into you, but you have to spend time meditating on what you're actually internalizing.
Exactly.
And it seems to me, and I'd like to hear your take on this, that we often short circuit that time spent, whether it's using the word as a launching pad for prayer, or using the word as a launching pad for just meditating and thinking about the interrelationships. How does this fit into the life that I'm trying to lead, and the challenges that I face on a daily basis? And it just seems to me that we short circuit that, don't spend nearly the time that we need to invest in thinking about what does this really mean in terms of of my own daily challenges.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I think that's true. I think a lot about uh, the the church environment that I grew up in, and it was a lot of the fill in the blanks in material that we were studying. There wasn't a lot of attention paid to younger people and making sure they got, and I'm going where I'm going with this is that it became like, for example, I'm gonna make sure you got the apostles memorized. That's really important. And I could, I could get in trouble with all this, but make sure you got the eight kings of Judah memorized. And then we've seen it. We've accomplished something, and that's dead end. I mean, that's closed in stuff. You got that down. Now you got it. You can move on. The meditation, the thinking, preaching so that people think about what you're saying, not just to pass along information, having classes where you allow people to sort this stuff out and work with it. I think that's key. That's key. And then personally, you mentioned David earlier, King David, and all the messes he got into, but look at Psalm 119. He talks about, I wake up at night meditating on God's word, just like, who does that? What's the first thing you think about in the morning? One guy was reading in somewhere, said that he tries, of course, he fails at this a lot, but he tries moment by moment to think about Jesus, just kind of moment by moment. And obviously there's going to be gaps in that, but that's his goal. That's his aim, to be a moment by moment thing, not, okay, I'm going to get up and read my Bible for 30 minutes this morning and then hopefully think about it the rest of the day. But he actually brings it right down to the bottom line. And I thought that was really good. I thought that was a good, because sometimes we don't think of it that way.
And I think you alluded to, and then also Sebastian earlier, about this whole idea that when we attempt this, we are going to fall short of the lofty goal and fall flat on our face from time to time.
Mm-hmm.
And so part of the learning process is being in and realizing that we're going to make some whopper mistakes along the way, but we've got to learn from those and use that as impetus to get back up and try again and do better next time around.
Right. I've got this quote from C.S. Lewis that says, Christ is beginning to turn you into the same kind of thing as himself. He is beginning, so to speak, to inject his kind of life and thought, his Zoe life, into you, beginning to turn the tin soldier into a live man. The part of you that does not like this is the part that is still tin.
That's good. I like it.
I think that really fits what we're talking about this morning. If we think we're going to reach some kind of perfection in this, then we're fooling ourselves, of course. Unfortunately, Jesus came, he was grace and truth. We're looking at truth and we're striving to do that. But, fortunately, we have grace to take care of it.
Yeah, if it's not grace driven, then it's not going to happen.
Right, exactly.
As sinful as we are.
Right.
Also,
okay, a final question here, and you both can weigh in on this, but how would the world be different if all Christians would take this aspiration to heart, give it their all, and God just unleashes an army of people who think like that? And that's a good question if I've ever.
I'll let David go first.
Well, I thought a lot of stuff. I said I can only imagine, we're light in the world and salt of the earth and all those, city on a hill, all those things that come to mind that Jesus said, because he did address that. One passage though, I think sums it up. I mean, you might have other ideas, and that's Philippians 2, 14, 15. Do all things without grumbling or disputing. We could start there. That would, right, to stop there and think about that one for a bit. That you may be blameless and innocent, children of God, without blemish in the midst of a crooked and twisted generation, lights of the world. it starts with, instead of grumbling and complaining about everything, kind of turning our sights upward, I would say, and then look inward, and then say, okay, I'm influencing the world. If it was just me, I'm influencing some part of my world, and this one always kind of brings me back down to ground zero. That this is what we're supposed to be doing. We're supposed to be people without blemish in the midst of a crooked and twisted generation. That's certainly what we're seeing. And it's always been that way. I mean, I grew up in the 60s. This is nothing new that we're seeing now, stuff we're seeing now.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of truth to that. People underestimate the power of the influence of one Christian. But if one Christian is thinking like Jesus and thinking about imitating him, however imperfectly, there's tremendous influence to be had just in going through that process and interacting with other people on a day-to-day level. There's power in the attempt.
Yes.
To think like him, to talk like him, to walk like him, to interact like him, and never underestimate the power that is available to you if you allow yourself to go into the shadows and allow Jesus to come to the surface as best you can, unhypocritically,
Right.
to just be one of his true servants, genuinely, in this wicked world. And great influence to be had in that. Sebastian, do you have anything to add?
And just in a way, echoing what you both just said, that it's in the attempt to be like him where we can really shine. If we pretend to put him on like we're perfect like him, then we're telling everybody else that you can't have the potential that you're supposed to. God doesn't expect us to be perfect. He gave us Jesus Christ to be perfect through him. And so and matter of fact, the sacrifice of Jesus Christ is designed to help us be perfect. And so if we acknowledge that in the way we're living and do our best, acknowledging that we're imperfect. I think of Paul, Romans 7 and 8. Just having the glory that Jesus Christ makes us perfect, but doing our best to be like him.
And when we do that, we're going to be focusing other people's attention not on us, but on Jesus. I make all kinds of mistakes, but I follow a perfect Savior.
Mm-hmm.
And to the extent that I could model some of his character, that's what I want you to see. It's nothing in me per se, but everything that revolves around him.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. We see Christ in me. Don't we have some songs like that? And Only in Thee, and a whole bunch of old and new songs that emphasize that goal and that pattern of life. That's what we're talking about here. Is how are we going to live? How are we going to live every day? We're either going to live in Christ or outside Christ. Those are the two choices. And everybody who's living in Christ is doing that. It's an attempt, as you said. It's trying. It's not. And there's a lot of credit for people who try. And we tend to do that even in every aspect of life. Well, we say, well, he tried, he made the effort, and we admire people who do that. I think God admires us, to kind of put it in human terms, that if we make that effort, and it's worth making. It's an effort worth making, because we can influence. We have influenced people. All three of us have influenced people one way or another. But I mean, we all know we have. I mean, Mike has influenced me, for sure. I've been around him for a long time at different times of my life, and so I mean, that's just the way it works. Our parents influence, you got different people. So, yeah, and Jesus is worth emulating. That there's no one else in the face of the earth that has ever lived that is more worthy of imitation.
Absolutely. I mean, if we look at our highest aspiration in life is to become like Jesus,
Right.
We can set the world on fire one person at a time in a good
Right.
way. In a good way. Great discussion. Any final thoughts that anyone might have?
I want to read something that just hit me square in the face when I read it, and kind of leave you with this, if you will. It's very short,
Okay.
but it's the way we speak of Jesus, the luminous Nazarene, as Albert Einstein once called him. Along with two thieves, he was executed by the authorities about 2,000 years ago. Yet today, from countless paintings, statues and buildings, from literature and history, from personality and institution, from profanity, popular song and entertainment media, from confession and controversy, from legend and ritual, Jesus stands quietly at the center of the contemporary world, as he himself predicted. He so graced the ugly instrument on which he died that the cross has become the most widely exhibited and recognized symbol on earth. That just it even when he uses puts profanity in here as an example, whoever says, when they're using some kind of profane, they don't say Buddha, they say it's actually Jesus who comes out because he's influenced the world. And who was he? He was in the view of so many, he was just a nobody who lived in a little tiny place, 2,000 years ago. And yet I thought about all the crosses we see all over the world. Why the cross? Why is that the symbol of people who have passed on? There's so many. It just really, and I had never thought of it that way. And just his worldwide influence, and wherever you go. So I thought that was, I think that was probably in Willard's book, but is it something?
Very good. That's a good note to end on. I'd like to tell folks listening in that 2 weeks from today, we'll be doing this again, and I'll be interviewing Shane Scott, who preaches in the Tampa Bay area of Florida, and we'll be kicking around the whole idea of pressure to conform to the world, pressure that Christians are under, and it's immense pressure these days to surrender non-negotiable elements of the faith just to fit in with contemporary society. And that's an extremely timely subject for these days. And so I look forward greatly to that conversation 2 weeks from today. And so look for that post online, YouTube, Facebook, etc. And David, thank you for your insights into this. It's been interesting as always. Conversations with you are always fascinating to me. And not only have I influenced you, you've influenced me greatly over the years. And I appreciate you very, very much. And thank you for your friendship. And to have a brother in Christ like you is an amazing thing. Sebastian, thanks again. As always, two of my best friends right here in front of me on screen. So how do I rate? And thank you for listening in if you're watching this, and we look forward to seeing you again in one of these future sessions.
Wonderful time, brothers.
Thank you.